Of all the challenges facing Israel, it seems that one threat simply refuses to leave the headlines, and that is Iran and its axis of evil. Israel's relations with Iran are particularly fascinating, especially in light of the fact that until the Iranian Revolution, Israel and Iran had maintained friendly relations. Today, of course, Iran poses an existential threat to Israel. For today's conversation, I would like us to examine the Iranian issue. Joining me is Advocate Ori Morad, the head of JIJ's International Law and Public Diplomacy Department. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Good afternoon, Ori.
Good afternoon, Lydia. I'm very happy to be here with you today, exploring this very important issue.
So, the history of Israel-Iran relations, is it actually the story of a close friendship that has turned into a deadly hostility?
So it is true that Israel and Iran had maintained friendly relations over 3 decades. Some would even define it as a warm relationship. Surprisingly, Iran was among the first countries to recognize the state of Israel's sovereignty back in the 1950s. Iran and Israel promoted and enjoyed real fruitful commercial cooperation. And an interesting and also an ironic fact is that the two countries, Israel and Iran, even promoted a joint project to develop a new missile.
That is ironic given today's circumstances. So, Uri, what was the turning point of this relationship?
The dramatic turning point of this relationship occurred in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The revolution marked the end of the pro-Western secular Iran era. Iran became the center of oppression and hatred and terrorism under an extremist Islamic theocracy. At this time, Iran completely eliminated its ties with Israel.
And what were the causes that led to the Iranian Revolution?
So the Iranian Revolution occurred due to the contention between two conflicting worldviews or two conflicting ideologies, the pro-Western conception on the one side and the opposing viewpoint that sees the pro-Western conception as an apostasy to the values of Islam. The revolution was an expression of a deep displeasure of the adoption of Western culture and the perceived rejection of the values of Islam. In order to restore the nation to its former glory, the conservative Islamic religious leaders believed that it was necessary to excise the Western values and to readopt a religious lifestyle according to the values of Islam. At the peak of the revolution in 1979, Muhammad Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, fled Iran and the Ayatollah Khomeini came into power.
It is important to note that the revolution in Iran had also gained support among secular populations, not just the radical religious ones.
Absolutely. However, this support was the result of a misrepresentation because we need to understand that what was promised to the people was a democratic revolution, one that would improve their quality of life. What they actually got is a cruel radical regime for which human rights values mean absolutely nothing.
From the 1980s until today, human rights continue to be violated in Iran. In the 2021 Iranian presidential elections in June, Ebrahim RAISI was elected. He is Iran's first president to personally be subject to U.S. sanctions even before he was elected. Can you tell us why?
So Ebrahim RAISI received this dubious honor for being one of 4 judges who oversaw the death penalty given to some 5,000 political inmates in the late 1980s.
It's important to know who we're dealing with. What else can you tell us about the new president of Iran?
So Iran's new president, Ebrahim RAISI, who's also known as the executioner from Tehran, was elected president of Iran in June of this year by a 60% majority. RAISI is an ultra-conservative and extremist cleric that headed the Iranian legal system and is a potential successor to Iran's spiritual leader, Ali Khamenei.
RAISI has indeed won the Iranian presidential elections, but how was voter turnout? What was the engagement?
It's a great point because the turnout in the last elections were around 48%. It was an unprecedented low that indicates the displeasure among the Iranian general public. It was a dissatisfaction of both the sham democratic process in which other viable candidates were politically prosecuted and then forced out of the elections, as well as a disappointment in the general direction that Iran is heading.
RAISI took office a few weeks ago, but who is truly running Iran today?
So, Iran is governed today by the Ayatollahs, the highest religious authority in Iran. The Ayatollahs set the political and the spiritual agenda for the country. Alongside the Ayatollahs works the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is responsible for both providing protection for the regime and is also tasked with developing and financing terrorist infrastructures. Let's not forget that 2 years ago, in 2019, the US State Department designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization.
Ori, can you tell us about the current situation in Iran and how this impacts the region?
There's a deep economic crisis in Iran. There's extensive poverty, corruption, and I would say a general feeling of hopelessness among the younger generation. In that sense, Raisi's presidency will be a continuation of the same negative trend. We need to understand that Raisi is the bad news on both the domestic Iranian level as well as for the entire international community and for Israel in particular.
What are the threats that Israel faces today from the Islamic Iranian regime?
So, Lydia, there are three major threats. First is Iran's nuclear capabilities. Second is the accurate missile firing capabilities through Hezbollah's Iranian-led precision-guided missile project, which actually equipping Iran, as well as its proxies in the Middle East, with accurate offensive capabilities from Lebanon, from Israel's northern border, into the depth of the Israeli territory. And third is Iran's increasing presence on Israel's northern border through its proxies in the region, and especially in light of the political and military vacuum created by the collapse of Lebanon that we just witnessed in these days. Worth mentioning is the fact that all three threats could become a casus belli or a cause for war between Israel and Iran.
Israel has faced many enemies and threats through the years and come out victorious. How does this situation differ?
I think that what makes the Iranian threat more dangerous is the unique combination of three different elements. First, because it rests upon an uncompromising radical religious ideology. Second is Iran's willingness to sacrifice their own people. The Iranians are absolutely and totally committed to its ultimate goal of claiming the status of a regional superpower in such a way that puts the importance of reaching that particular goal far above the value of the people working to achieve it. And third is the Iranian leadership is, I would call it, very strategic, very savvy at negotiating, and they are playing the game with endless patience. They don't shy away or they don't back down after failures or small setbacks along the way. And I think that the combination of all three elements, that's what makes the Iranians such a huge threat for Israel.
You just mentioned failures. We know that the Iranians have recently experienced a number of significant blows. Can you please outline those for us?
Absolutely. The last year for the Iranians has been probably one of the hardest Iran has known in the past 3 decades. And contributing to Iran's recent challenges were the assassination of both the Quds Force commander and of the head of their nuclear program, the huge embarrassment caused by the Israeli Mossad success to penetrate and reveal Iran's secret nuclear program, alongside the success of the Israeli strategy for peace in the Middle East through the Abraham Accords. And all of these actually stands alongside the crisis, the internal crisis, economic crisis that Iran is having at the moment, along with Iran's struggle to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you for those details. Uri, there has been a lot of discussion regarding the Iran nuclear deal. 3 years have passed since the US withdrew from it. What does the deal entail?
So the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as you said the Iran nuclear deal or the JCPOA, was a 159-page agreement with one clear goal: imposing significant restrictions on Iran's nuclear plan. The deal was signed back in 2015 between Iran and the 5 permanent UN Security Council members, which are the US and China, the United Kingdom, France and Russia, and was also signed by Germany and the EU. In terms of the deal itself, the deal included both permanent and temporary restrictions, all, as we said, to halt the Iranians from becoming a nuclear threshold state. In return for the lifting of economic sanctions, Iran agreed to limit its sensitive nuclear activities and allow the oversight of international inspectors. Iran agreed to completely eliminate its stockpile of medium enriched uranium, and they also agreed to cut its stockpile of low enriched uranium by 98% and reduced by about 2/3 the number of its gas centrifuges.
US President Biden recently met with former Israeli President Ruvi Rivlin. During that meeting, Biden promised that on his watch, Iran would never acquire nuclear capabilities. How close is Iran to establishing itself as a nuclear threshold state today, Uri?
Yeah, probably the million-dollar question. Biden and his cabinet have consistently stated they will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear capabilities for military purposes. Nevertheless, they have not explicitly stated that they will prevent Iran from reaching the nuclear threshold needed to weaponize their nuclear energy. In fact, distinguished experts have concluded recently that the Iranians are just a few months away from being able to use their nuclear capabilities for military purposes. The International Atomic Energy Agency actually supported this finding by confirming that Iran has in fact enriched uranium to 60%. Let's not forget that 60% is the minimum level allowing for military use of nuclear power. And given that the National Security Studies, which is an Israeli research institute, has since confirmed the finding of this particular report, we can assume Iran is dangerously close to being capable of producing nuclear weapons.
In April of this year, mediated by European factions, representatives of both the US and Iran met in Vienna to discuss the steps needed to return to the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal. This round of talks began with great expectancy and optimism. However, we're now a few months into negotiations, and Uri, it seems like discussions are close to a dead end.
Indeed, I agree. It seems that the talks will reach an end without a significant achievement. After 7 rounds of talks, the Iranians have made it very clear that they have no intention of returning to the table before the establishment of the new government headed by President-elect RAISI.
What does Iran hope to achieve by waiting?
I think the Iranians are handling the diplomatic battle, as we said, with endless patience. Right now, it seems like they simply want to gain more time and they are stalling. It's a very, very typical tactics, I would say, for the Iranians. In the meantime, they intend to take another step towards declaring a nuclear threshold state, so they will be able to return to the negotiating table with a more significant bargaining chip. They also believe that the negotiating team under RAISI will be able to get a better deal, one that would include more American concessions. And I must say that I say this under the assumption that the Iranian regime is still interested in returning to the 2015 deal. Right now, their desire for that is intentionally vague.
So, in your opinion, what should Israel do in light of all of these threats from Iran?
I think that Israel needs to focus on four main efforts at the moment. First and foremost, ensuring at any cost that Iran will not have nuclear capability, even at the cost of launching an attack. To continue to develop and strengthen regional alliances such as the peace agreements with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates and Morocco and Sudan. 3. Establish deterrence and take an independent stand against Iran, one that does not depend on the American support. And last but not least, is halting Iranian proxies and preventing Iranian intensification on Israel's northern border. I think that accomplishing those goals will allow Israel to successfully defend itself.
Thank you, Uri. We've tackled some of the main issues regarding the history and the relationship between Israel and Iran today. Thank you so much for joining us. Please email your questions to Uri at the email on the screen below.
Thank you very much, Lydia, for having me today. It was a pleasure being here. I hope all of you find this information helpful and that you join us for our next webinar.